to Studio Espresso. I am your host, Clarice, and this is quintessential 90s music, songs that continue to live and move us today. We meet the creators in the studio. Today, our guest is award-winning engineer, mixer, producer, Jim Scott. Jim has worked with Wilco, Slayer, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Johnny Cash, to name a few. And the song we're going to talk about today is You Don't Know How It Feels by Tom Petty from his Wildflowers album that was released in '94 and also re-released in 2020 last year by his family. Now, when it comes to career serendipity, I would say that Jim has it all. Jim, when you were working with the Dream of the Blue Turtles with Sting, you met another great musician. Tell me about who that was and what it led to.
Hi, Clarice. Thanks for having me today. It's great to see you.
Good to see you.
Looking forward to seeing you when COVID is over, but it won't be long. Yeah, the Sting record was amazing. I was very lucky to get hired to record it, and we did the record down at Eddie Grant's Blue Wave Studio in Barbados. And I was down there with Sting and he was writing songs and we were trying to figure out how to make the record. And then suddenly his band showed up, the Blue Turtles showed up, and it was Omar Hakim and Branford Marsalis and Kenny Kirkland and Daryl Jones, all
amazing,
the best New York jazz players in the world. And I became friends with all of them. And 6 months after we finished that record, I got a call from Branford Marsalis to if I would come to New York and record a jazz record with him. I had never recorded any jazz and had never even listened to very much jazz, but I was lucky enough to go there, and I worked with him and his brother Delfio. And we recorded a record called The Dream of the Blue Turtle. We recorded a record called The Royal Garden Blues.
Royal Garden Blues, that's right.
We went to #1 in the jazz chart, knocking Miles Davis's Tutu out of #1 spot.
Amazing, so cool. So tell me about how you met Rik Ruben, speaking of New York, and how you ended up working on Wildflowers.
Well, I met Rik Ruben. I don't remember exactly. He was obviously a very successful New York producer, and I think he wanted a Los Angeles presence, and he wanted to be able to make records in California, and was just looking for people to work with. And somehow I got an interview, and we met, and kind of one thing led to another. We started doing some records. I think the first thing we worked on together was a Wolf Spain record. And then we worked on some, in those days, Rik, as he is now, of course, he can make any kind of record, but the records we were making were very heavy. Records with Danzig and Slayer and Wolfsbane. But suddenly there was a shift, and he began to do more of the amazing singer-songwriter records. And Tom was one of those artists, one of the best singer-songwriters of our time, and Rik was hired to produce the Wildflowers record, and I was just on the team. I was one of his go-to engineers, and we worked together for many years.
How would you describe his production style on this album? If there was like one or two things that stand out, or I mean, some of the things that were different about this album, not specific to Rik, is that Petty, he was the executive producer, you said. How did that come about?
Well, I think Tom had always taken his own career by the reins many times. He was pretty fearless, and he had walked away from record companies, and he'd walked away from, he had battles. He had a really great sense of right and wrong, and he kind of felt that sometimes the record companies were charging too much money for the product, and he would lose fans, and people couldn't afford it. And Tom wasn't afraid to go to court and fight for what he believed was right. So I think at one point Tom, whether he took the credit or not, was the producer slash executive producer on everything that he did. But
Uh-huh.
you know, Rik's style of production is actually really beautiful. It's he always wants the best possible songs and will work and work and work on the songs, and not just go into the studio and start recording or writing and see what happens. He wants to have all of that together before we go to the studio. But if I had to describe Rik's production style, it's everything is loud, everything is clear, and everything is pretty simple.
I
And
like that.
that
That-
sounds easy, but it's harder than you think.
Yeah. So this album, there were originally about 25 songs. Um, and the legend goes that Lenny Waronker with Warner Brothers, his new label, thought that was too many, just do it for one album. And so that's how you ended up with one album. Um, and then his family has re-released it last year, the rest of the songs with some other tidbits.
That's
Um, you also mentioned during this time there were several drummers that were auditioned. Tell me about that process and who they were.
well, we were at Sound City and we were trying to, you know, the Wildflowers record is a Tom Petty record. It's not a Heartbreakers record. Obviously, Mike and Benmont and Howie played on the record, but it it was approached as a Tom Petty solo record, and they were auditioning rhythm sections. And I know for a fact that Kenny Aronoff did audition. I know for a fact that Jerry Sheff, the great Jerry Sheff, bass player for Elvis Presley and Roy Orbison and everybody, he also auditioned. And you're just sort of awed by these rhythm sections in there playing with Tom and Mike and Ben. But ultimately, when the auditions were done, it was Steve Ferrone who took the chair and is still in it.
Wow. Was it Dave Grohl and Vinnie Coliuda were there too?
I didn't work with Dave or Vinny with the Heartbreakers, although there's Dave did play with the Heartbreakers on TV several times, um, as they were actually even promoting the Wildflowers record. I mean, Steve Ferrone's been in the band for so long since then, but I think he also had some commitments that he, previously scheduled commitments, and he couldn't make a couple of TV shows. So, yeah, there's some great YouTube videos of Dave Grohl playing with the Heartbreakers on television.
Oh.
And it's funny because he comes in so loud that you can actually see everybody sort of duck in, like, holy cow, what just happened? So, yeah, and Mike gives him a big smile when he first
Yeah.
starts.
And you're right, because the Heartbreakers are credited as session musicians on this album.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is
Tom made
unique.
Tom Petty records, and he made Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers records. And
Yeah.
it's
Now, you talk about the several studios. Which ones were they? And because you said it took over a year making of the album. So
yeah.
which studios were you at, and who was making decisions about where to go?
Well, it was primarily done at Sound City. Most of the tracks were recorded at Sound City. A lot of the overdubs were done at Mike Campbell's private studio in his house, Mike Campbell's clubhouse. A lot of the overdubs and maybe some of the tracking were done at Ocean Way, East West Cello, the 6,000 building on Sunset, if whatever you want to call it.
Your old home. Yeah.
I know. I love those studios. But it was mostly a Sound City thing. We would we'd work for a week and record 3 or 4 songs, and then we'd take a break, and Tom would write more songs, and then we'd reconvene, and off we'd go back to the studio and set it all up again. Oh, there's Tom in Studio 2
Yep.
at Cello or East West.
Yep. That's right.
What a handsome guy.
Now let's talk a bit about the song "You Don't Know How It Feels." It became a chart topper. It's a memorable song, of course. And what was his approach in the studio when it came to the song? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, whenever Tom would bring, my memory is that Tom would, even though home demos are surfacing of of these songs. Tom did demos of them at home. I really don't remember him bringing in a cassette and saying, here's the song, listen to this and we'll go learn it. I remember him standing in the middle of the room with his guitar and playing and singing the song, and everybody either just listening, thinking, maybe making notes, but probably not. And he'd play it once or twice, and then they'd just all go to their station and start to figure it out, whether it was all electric, all acoustic, what Benmont was going to play, piano or organ or synthesizer or harpsichord, and Steve would figure out the beat. And it's just like, that's what bands do. And you know, gosh,
The organic process, yeah.
how long they'd been together, and they communicated, and they just they could all read each other pretty well. That's how I remember it.
This is towards the end of his life. You know, he had an interview with LA Times, and he said that writing is lonely work. He likened writing to catching a fish and said this song was like catching a big fish. What can you say about the song and why it connects to our times today? Still relevant, you know, still, especially in this, maybe does it have to do with the isolation time we're going through? Or, I mean, it's,
you know, I wish I really knew. Tom was a great storyteller, but he also was a deep, personal, and sweet guy. And this song, you know, is about, I think it's about him. I mean, it could be more universal than that, but I really do believe that it's about him. It's pretty heavy, but he also has the ability to, you know, he's a funny guy too. And in the middle of this heavy song about "You Don't Know How It Feels to Be Me," he's got his old man learning, you know, Born to Rock, Beat the Clock. You know, his old man didn't rock. He was a businessman, you know. But there's a, you know, without going into therapy or something like that, you know, Tom wasn't bashful about wearing his heart on his sleeve, and this is one, if there ever was one, for sure.
yeah, the authenticity. And, you know, I mean, it's at some point you think what's harsh or tough about rolling a joint, you know, it's a happy song, but then you discover the layers, and, you know, it takes on multiple meanings. Hey, on a different note, you are the vibe man in a studio. Tell me why did you create a studio vibe, a Jim Scott studio vibe? What is that, and why did you create it? What are the results? Talk a little bit about.
Well, thanks. You know, I'm not the first guy to try to dim the lights and light a candle and light some incense. You know, setting the mood is good for a dinner date. You know, setting the mood is good for lots of things.
I see some of that behind you.
Yeah, setting the mood is, in my experience, has been really good for the artists that I've worked with. And, you know, the studios that we've mentioned, you know, Sound City, Poor Old Sound City, and, you know, Cello Studio 2, these are old studios that were built in the 50s or the 60s. And they get used every day, and they don't get new carpet every day, and they don't get new drapes every day, and they don't get new paint every day. And people, it was the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and people are smoking cigarettes and cigars and weed and incense, and it, after a while it gets a little funky in there. So what I always like to do is take some beautiful fabrics, pin them up on the walls, take some Christmas lights and poke them around so you can turn the fluorescent lights off and have some ambient lighting. Maybe light a candle, light some incense, and just, you know, hope everybody enjoys it. Everybody calms down. And when they go to work, they're in a kind of a magical, special place instead of some place that's more of like an office or a laboratory, or, you know, somebody else's version of like where music should be made. Yeah. I grew up in the 60s, and I enjoyed them. So I just try to smile. I just try to bring a smile to everyone's face and calm everybody down a little bit.
Yeah. Well, proof is in the pudding. It works. So So speaking of working and the many hours and months of sessions in this case, the Wildflowers, there are a lot of takes. And as an engineer, you had to keep track of all of that. Talk a little bit about maybe for up and comers, what's your strategy and method of documenting and keeping track of all of this stuff that's going on?
Well, thanks. Some people that listen to this might not realize what recording on analog tape is like. But when you record on analog tape, you don't have a visual aid of where anything is. On Pro Tools, you have a visual aid. You can look at the screen and go like, there's take one, there's take two, there's where the bass comes in, there's the chorus. But on analog tape, you can't see anything, you can only hear. So sometimes you wouldn't necessarily know, like, is that take one? Is that take two? Did we start and stop? Did we do a false start? Did we roll back? Like, you needed some sort of proof to know, like, where are we? What take is this? It's not enough to write down that you think it's take 1, 2, and 3 on the reel, because there could be a mistake there. There could be a false start. You could listen to a 3-minute long take that was never finished, and somebody thinks it's actually take 3 when it's actually not take 3 at all, but it's like a piece of something that never got finished. So what we used to do back in the day is I would actually have a microphone, and when they got ready, when I heard somebody starting to count off, I would say, take 2 or take 4. And I think if you listen to Wildflowers, you hear me saying take 4 right at the beginning of Wildflowers, because I had to record on one of the tracks, and that track probably had a room mic on it or something that was maybe expendable. But part of the process doesn't change between then and now. You have to pay attention. Oh, wow, look at that. Who are those guys?
Yeah, that's a vintage photo, right? So I thought, there you are. You actually kind of look like Sting there a little bit, and you're cutting George Draculius's hair with a.
Well, George and I are very close. We're very intimate.
Yeah.
Once you get into personal grooming, what's Mickey
Yeah.
holding there?
I don't know.
That's a great
But hey, I wanted to also just have you talk a little bit about your studio now. You're working on a tribute album for Neil Cassell, the late Neil Cassell.
Thank you.
And your studio is called, how do you pronounce it? PLYRZ?
It's called PLYRZ. It's
Oh,
like
PLYRZ.
a pair of pliers. And it's got a funny spelling, like a 60s spelling, like the birds is BYRDS, and
Right.
the circle CYRKLE. The pliers.
Okay, I get it. I get it now. So anybody can check out PLYRZ Studios, Google it.
Yeah.
Jim Scott's also on Studio Espresso. If you want to just, look him up, certainly do. But yeah, talk a little bit about your studio and what are the advantages of having your own studio, and a little bit about the project that you're doing.
Well, thanks. My studio is very much an analog studio. I've been in the business a long time, and I came up working on consoles, working on tape recorders, using equipment in racks, and that's what I know, and that's what I own. So I have an analog studio with Neve consoles. I have a tracking room, and I have a big warehouse room with all my equipment in it. And I'm pretty much self-contained here. I do all my own producing and engineering here. We do record on Pro Tools, but we use all vintage mic pre's and all vintage compressors and mostly vintage microphones for the signal chain. And it's very much an analog process, but we use a Pro Tools computer as our recording device instead of a tape recorder. So it's very much like how we used to do records in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But there is a little bit of a.
You don't have to set up and tear down all the time, so you got more time.
I don't. I'm happy. It's just you know, you have to work quicker these days. No one has 6 or 8 weeks or several months to make a record. You got to make records much more quickly. So I keep, you know, I keep things mic'd up. The piano's ready, the organ's ready, the vocal mic's ready, the drums are ready. Bunch of extra stuff. Guitar amps are where they're supposed to be. The bass amps where it's supposed to be. You know, we move quickly through the process as quickly as we can because that's the nature of the business now.
Right, right.
And having my own place and not having to share the space with anyone else
Facilitates that.
just really does speed things up. And
Yeah.
and we just we make music all day. We don't set things up and tear things down all day. We somebody wants to try an overdub with some instrument, there's a mic on it and we can just do it.
Well, thank you for taking us for a musical magical journey with Tom Petty and the song You Don't Know How It Feels. It feels great to see you, Jim.
I miss you.
So miss you too. We'll see you soon.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.